So, we all know that deathcore in general gets a lot of hate by the metal community, no matter what. You so much as mention deathcore around some metalheads, and you're going to get upturned noses and hand wavings of shoo! But recently, there's been some added attention to the scene, specifically regarding one of the main leaders of the genre. Suicide Silence. Yeah, everyone who's paid attention knows the story. Their latest album had some concerns surrounding it after it was announced pre-release that their self-titled would feature something like 60 to 75% clean vocals in total. Then two pre-release singles dropped, Doris and Silence, both of which featured the cleans we were hearing about, and they received mixed reactions. Doris especially, spawning many Tee-Hee references, and even having the band's Wikipedia page edited to say Tee-Hee Metal, and with every track on their self-titled renamed to Tee-Hee in some form or another. Silence wasn't much better, although I'll focus my own feelings on that track later on. My main point is, this is a deep inspection/review of the self-titled Suicide Silence album, where I go in-depth where I can, to figure out just why this album is so poorly regarded. Now this will be track by track, but mostly with the focus on Eddie Hermida's vocals, which may have been the one thing that made this album so infamous. But first, we're going to start with some history. No, we're not. I cut it at last minute. Let's ask ourselves this question, ladies and gentlemen, to kick off the review. What makes this self-titled, full-length Suicide Silence album so poorly regarded?
Let's find out.
Track 1, Doris. Now everybody knows that this track gets a lot of flack, but honestly I found it to be the best track on the album because the more I listened to it, the more it caught on, and the more I think that now, despite the weird direction, this track built up a lot of promise for the album. But yeah, it still has obvious flaws. Right as you start this track, it just pumps you up. Eddie's screaming his head off just to let out energy, delivers his first verse, and it's like, yeah, let's burn down some Norwegian churches and kill people. Wait, no. I mixed that up. Yeah, let's spit out our gum on the school floor and push this fat kid against the wall. And then we get to the main reason why this song is so hated directly after the first verse. Yep, the Tee-Hee moment. It sounded so ridiculous to me too, and I still make fun of it every chance I get, but the more I've listened to it, the more it's grown on me. It's a really unexpected turn for the track when you first hear it. I mean, how many vocalists go from harsh vocals to almost a whimper for the chorus? However, while it does grow on me, not everything about the chorus is good, obviously. The whimper, or the Tee-Hee as I will now call it, is pretty unique, but the second bit afterwards doesn't support it quite as well when Hermida sings, "Either way, this blood will rot." And what is with the lyrics for this song? These are just confusing because I kind of get the hint that these lyrics allude to some form of cheating or adultery, relatable topics. But then the chorus talks about blood rotting and how the blood is coming through his eyes, which is like, what? Instrumentally, the whole song isn't bad at all. I like the melodic guitar playing during the chorus, and everything else sounds like, well, Suicide Silence. It's not actually that bad. So overall, why is it hated so much? Well, I think mostly because of the vocal direction Hermida took. Safe to say it isn't a good transition. Even though it's probably the simpler track here in terms of vocals and progression, it still definitely needs refining, but I think it brings too much hate. If it wasn't the first single released on this album, I think people would like it more. And as it turns out, this is, in my opinion, the best track on the album, so that'll say a bit about the other ones. Track 2, Silence. This is the first instance on this album where I always crack up from the direction that Hermida took here. One part in particular is hilarious enough on its own. So similar to how Doris had a sudden shift of pitch that wasn't really necessary for the track, Silence goes the other direction. Eddie pretty much reverses course, going from soft singing to rah! In the first line, which is less than 10 words. People call this album the Saint Anger of Deathcore, and I think that this is the track that may justify the explanation more because this little bit reminds me of the ending lines to The Unnamed Feeling. Listen to these two bits back to back. I just wanna get the fuck away from me. Does it not sound similar to you direction-wise? Now in the pre-chorus, I actually like the style, with the slight distortion effect put over Eddie's voice supported by the guitar, but the first time I heard it, I knew it was ripped off from another band's sound. I don't know what band, and I haven't heard any other song do this style, but I already know it should be ripped off from someone. Regardless, it still sounds good, but again, similar to Doris, it needs polish because this sounds more like the finished version instrumentally, but with the demo stage vocals. And I'm not talking production, I'm talking ability wise. And then we get to the actual chorus. At least the lyrics here allude to Eddie killing someone, which it takes nothing to see just how still you can be, and death is all I hear, which on an unrelated note, if they had named this track Suicide Silence and gave it better writing, that'd be another thing to add to the Black Sabbath and Low Roar I ran out of title ideas awards. Anyways, the lyrics are actually fairly understandable, more so than Doris, but the way Eddie delivers them again needs polish. He actually tries to mix singing with harsh vocals here, and boy oh boy does it sound silly. Silence is pretty much the opposite of Doris in some ways. Silence doesn't follow as conventional a sound pattern as Doris does, but the same vocal structure is used, albeit flipped. So I pretty much have the same opinion of it. Not that bad, but that ends the two singles that were released before the main album dropped. Unless there was another single, but anyways. Remember how I said that Doris was the best track here? Well, if Silence is very close to that spot, what of the next track? Track 3, listen. Believe me, I really tried. Right off the bat, the beginning riff is as basic as you can probably get with this album. In fact, I'm getting a sort of nu metal vibe with how the instruments progress here, and that's not in a good way. It reminds me of Awaken Providence with their riff on Black Mass, although it works better on that track than it does here. I actually almost thought I started playing a cover of Limp Bizkit's Break Stuff until I realized, wait, there's an additional note on the second part. I mean, what the hell, SS? Instrumentally, this is the same lineup that did You Only Live Once and Sacred Words. Also, Eddie, what are you doing on the vocals, man? For you to actually fuck up the harsh vocals when harsh vocals are clearly your stronger suit, it makes me wonder what else was approved for inclusion on this album. And it's as if everything holds for a bit while Eddie struggles to finish his verse. This isn't the only time he does it as well. In one of the quieter moments, he replicates the hilarious moment I mentioned in Silence, except this time he tries it with all harsh vocals. So take me along through the torrential clouds. The perfect storm will never be good enough. Great, so I'm guessing the next major tone change will be done all in cleans. He even tries mixing harsh vocals with some clean vocals in a way that makes Attack Attack look as if they have more of a mastery over the technique. Attack Attack has more mastery. But seriously, I get the point of experimentation, and I know Eddie is doing just that, but really, was it so hard to say,
Hey, dude, maybe we should spend more time perfecting this?
Maybe it is the Saint Anger of deathcore. Maybe the rough sound was intentional and it's supposed to sound bad. Lyrically, the track is repetitive as hell, with the same lyrics in the beginning repeated 3 times total, and nothing different besides the last 3 lines, which is simply, "I'll listen." Alright. What was everything else about? Instrumentally, this is one of the lazier tracks because there's none of that signature Suicide Silence brutality, which should indicate that the lyrics are more important on this track, but they're also the laziest lyrics you hear so far on this album, so what's the point? Overall, this is weak. Track 4, Dying in a Red Room. Before I start, this is the worst track on the entire album. Now, granted, it isn't bad straight from the start like the previous 2 tracks were, because Eddie actually pulls himself together and sings his first line here actually competently. Although, in deathcore and metalcore, if you can sing your lines competently, then you're generic, but that's how Eddie sounds here. And the riff is decent enough sounding, and the lyrics are a thing, so how could it be the worst track? Well, it's pretty much hard rock. It's a total deviation from the usual sound, and there's no real reason for it. It would have worked had I wanted to hear some Queens of the Stone Age like Clockwork tracks, but no, I listened to this album for a deathcore band, Suicide Silence, and even if it were a ballad, I'd still like it, but this isn't a ballad. This is just something else entirely different. It doesn't sound like SS at all, and that's including the vocal performance.
I'm dying through life. I'm living through death.
Of course, it had to be on the non-Suicide Silence track that Eddie actually sings well, and I almost don't believe it's Eddie because just look at the tracks before this. Do you think this guy could actually clean sing well for a whole song after hearing the 3 tracks prior? Surprisingly, it doesn't need polish, however, and instead we get a quiet moment in this album. Lyrically, Eddie explained that it was supposed to be some sort of love song to the quote, ghosts we carry around with us, unquote, which I guess this is some weird attempt at a love song because what else could it be? Apart from being the most disconnected, it's also one of the more boring ones. What about the next track? Track 5, Hold Me Up, Hold Me Down. It starts out okay, I guess, and for the first minute I was content with it being a Suicide Silence track that sounded like every other band member was exhausted. But then the hook came, and what is happening? Is it intentional for Eddie to sound like he's disinterested, but also trying to sound like he's in distress, but also trying to make it sound like he's crying, while contrasting it with the second part of the hook that doesn't fit at all style-wise? When he says hold me down, it's kinda cool, but hold me up just sounds like he's drunk and in regret. On top of all that, the production takes a sort of nosedive in quality. Like, it sounded clearer on the prior tracks, but now it has slight distortion and sounds muddy. Nothing really mixes well on this track at all, especially on the hook. Midway through the song, it takes a slower death metal or doom metal direction, which is to say, it's boring. And it goes for the rest of the song. Did they run out of ideas? The best part of this song was the opening minute, and then from there it just boop! Gone are the seconds of adequate quality. Track 6, Run. Run opens with an actual good sounding breakdown and follows it up with decent clean singing, although, again, at best, it's generic decent. What really confuses me, though, is the effect that Eddie has on his voice at the chorus. It differs greatly from the sound we heard only seconds earlier, but hey, this track actually has a good chorus that isn't flawed as much as I expected it to be. The build-up isn't that great, but at least for the lackluster build-up, the chorus met expectations. It's not brutal or insane. In fact, it sounds like a mix of grunge with some deathcore elements in it. This is perhaps one of the better songs, maybe second to Doris or third, but I still haven't forgotten the style they had on previous releases, including Can't Stop Me. And comparing that style to this is like seeing your little boy grow up to be a dope dealer in Portland, Oregon. You're not necessarily happy, but it could be worse. Track 7, The Zero. So the production actually sounds much better now after the previous 2 tracks, and what do we get along with this welcome change? Spoken word?
Everything expires sometimes before its time. Now drift away.
I was a little caught off guard, but at least it's not Listen's technique. The chorus actually has some great harsh vocals, and the instrumental actually has some energy behind it. Relative to the last 2 recent tracks, that is.
I am in love with the emptiness. The zero brings us back tonight.
I have no real problem with Eddie's singing here, but again, it needs some polish. There's some areas where he shows strain hitting some notes, or where it sounds a little rough. I mean, this track didn't entirely put me to sleep like the others had a potential of doing, but it's something that I'd actually show someone if they wanted to get into this album. No, I wouldn't show them Doris or Silence, I'd show them The Zero, because even though it's lacking in some ferocity, it's still a decent track to start out with. However, There is a lack of anything unique, bad or good with this song. The problem with most of the other tracks on here besides the first three is that most of them lack a standout feature. There's no tee-hees here, nor are there any good directions in this song being taken instrumentally. There's just average progressions here. Not that that's always a bad thing, but as we only have 2 tracks left, it's something to think about for those of you who want to give this album a full listen. Track 8, Conformity, aka The opening is quite an odd thing to hear at first, but honestly, upon hearing it, it is probably the best use of any soft singing Eddie performs on this album.
Disembodied whispers trickle in my ear. I'll give through the shroud.
And with that going along with the acoustics to either side of your headphones, or earbuds if you're an uncultured swine, this seemed like it would be a good ballad, reminding me at first of Beyond All Recognition's Future Behind. Well, it picks up energy around a minute and a half into the song, and okay, just put yourself into my shoes for a second. I'm listening to this track, right? And I'm leaning back in my chair just listening to a nice, calmer track unfold, and then suddenly Eddie's like,
This!
out of nowhere, making me jump a bit. First thought afterwards, though, wasn't, what the hell was that? No, my first thought afterwards was, oh god, no. Don't ruin this ballad. Thank Raptor Jesus up above it didn't go into breakdown mode during the hook, but Eddie starts shouting and his loud singing is odd.
Conformity is the secret. Conformity saves us all.
Like he's reaching notes that are just a weird combination that don't really fit in with the tune of the instrumental. 3 minutes in and we completely feel the end of the ballad, and along with the instrumental we get to hear a wailing solo that honestly is pretty damn cool. But it ends kind of abruptly for me. To return to Eddie's note experimentation, this time with harsher vocals that again aren't great to hear, but all in all I'd say that it wouldn't be a big waste of my time, unlike half of the other tracks here. I can see a lot more people listening to this track outside of the album had the album not had all the tee-hee hype around it provided by Doris. It's not perfect, but it's good. It actually exceeded the expectations I had, provided they were fairly low to begin with. Last track, don't be careful or you might hurt yourself. Too late, I already did. So for the last track on this album in the opening, we actually get fast. I'm not kidding, people, we get actual suicide silence here, rather than the stages of meth addiction we heard earlier. I was honestly pretty happy to hear this. It doesn't disappoint instrumentally overall, and it ends the album somewhat on a high note. Eddie does harsh vocals relatively well, and the flaws here are not enough to drag down the feeling of hope that the band might return to the sound that got them popular in the first place. However, the track kind of falls off as it progresses, sadly. For some reason around the semi-rap, semi-spoken word cleans on the bridge, they just take away from the action in the beginning.
You must live in love to hope this race will fail. I don't wanna watch you down this place to death.
Like, dude, we get it. Lyrics are artsy. Get to the moshing! Speaking of the lyrics, this line sums up this album perfectly. Somehow it is safe to fail. Yeah, that line pretty much explains why Suicide Silence wasn't dropped by Nuclear Blast Records even as reviews of this album were heavily negative, and sales tanked in comparison to their last full-length release. Lord forbid they do it again, though. Anyways, overall the track ends this album on a goodish note, and now I can tell my opinion of this album after having subjected myself listening to it. Summary! Yay! While the tee-hees and stuff are funny, and it certainly is hilarious seeing how Eddie can embarrass himself on some of these tracks, I don't really think this album is as bad as almost every uninformed meathead in the metal community says it is. Once you get past the bad and or weird tracks here, you get some decent tracks, even if they are a bit bland. All of these tracks have problems to each, mainly on the vocal side of things, and the instrumentals sound a bit bored overall. It just sounded rushed. There is some entertainment, though, in the bad side of things. It's certainly not so bad it's good, but you can still get enjoyment from laughing or trying your hardest to figure out the process behind this album. To give it an overall score, I'd say a 5 to a 6 on this thing. It's an interesting specimen to examine. And now that examination has concluded.
Grand spirit leads us flow into the ocean. I will break you before I break myself. The perfect storm will never be good enough. Past the shoes I